Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here as the moderator of this session. I shall say that it's a pleasure to be in Russia, and for me especially, it's a very special thing being here, because since I was a kid, I had this dream of coming to Russia. My father worked during the Olympics in 1980, and since then I have been listening to him talking about Russia and the beauty and everything, and I could actually realize that it's really as beautiful as he told me. We are talking about legal aspects of modern urban planning of heritage cities. It's a very important issue. We all know, mainly people who like traveling, that many places all around the world are declared historical heritage and historical cities. So the countries, the states, the cities, they have special legal procedures in order to declare those historical buildings and things, in order to patrimonialize them. And we are going to discuss this here, and we'll have different backgrounds, and we'll be able to discuss and know how it works in different places. I would like to invite, I apologize if I make any mistakes regarding the names. They are also different to us, so I apologize. I would like to invite Mr. Alexander Arseniev, Senior Vice President for Legal Affairs, YIT.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon. I would like to cover this topic from the view of the business people. It was absolutely right to formulate this topic as a comprehensive issue, and three parties should be actively involved in this: the authorities, cultural entities, and the business. But I would like to focus on the business point of view. I believe when we speak about development of cities with many historical landmarks, one of the key issues which should be resolved in Russia is the appropriate development of these towns and cities. If we look at Russian towns with great historical past, what we lack here, we don't have a strategy, an approved in normative documents, a strategy for future development. And we need to be absolutely sure what we protect and conserve in these cities. Do we protect everything, the historical core, the whole environment, or do we protect specific buildings? Or should we focus on what UNESCO included into the historical heritage, like historical center in St. Petersburg or Yaroslavl? So what we need is certainty in this regard, because if we look at investors, they are most valuable because they can help to preserve cultural heritage. Investors need absolute certainty. They need to be absolutely sure about the rules in dealing with historical heritage and whether these rules will remain unchanged in future. So we need to identify our paths, whether we are going to conserve the cities like the historical center of St. Petersburg, or we would like to allow when historical buildings stand next to modern buildings. So the lack of strategy that I mentioned leads to the situation when there's no systemic solutions and everything depends on situation. So in Moscow, they allow too much, and in St. Petersburg, as they say, they are too conservative. And although experts community understands how to deal with this, but in the area of regulation, there are certain lacking points. Of course, there is a certain urban planning specifics, because public interest is in the sphere of protecting and conserving landmarks, and there should be special rules of development these zones. And if we look at Russia, we have a unified approach to greenfield projects somewhere on the outskirts and to projects which are in the center of St. Petersburg or Moscow. Although, of course, we all are aware that the conditions are different and there should be different rules. One more important aspect is that cultural buildings should have a new life. It shouldn't be so when we see a vacant building and it is not used in any way. It is also important to complete the work in the area of identification of cultural heritage elements, and if the state believes that a certain building is important for future development, then the government should decide who is going to be responsible for the future life of this project. Maybe the government itself, or maybe if this building can be converted to modern use, then this project can be transferred to the investor who will be adjusting it to modern use. And currently we see that there are many vacant buildings in quite a shabby state, and this is very common in the historical center. We all need common policy in this area, because right now we see different approaches at the federal and regional levels. The federation sees one way, and regions, and very often with good justification, they see a different perspective, and this may lead to chaos and uncertainty, which affects development of cities. And I can use Moscow as an example. Over there, when we see modern buildings standing next to old historical buildings, is not in line with the purposes of city development. We always need to have a clear understanding what we are doing in cities and how we are going to do it in future. This is briefly how we see it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alexander. I would like to address a question for you and for all the members here. I read an article in Brazil that I found very interesting, and the question is the attempt to preserve the material and immaterial cultural heritage of cities against the richness and diversity of modern urban life? This has a lot to do with what you just said, and I would like to know what you think about it. Do we have a contradiction, by one hand, trying to preserve culture, and by other hand, avoiding modernization, new life?
Yeah, this is the question, because if we look at Europe, we see that there's different approaches in different towns. In some towns, they prohibit any new construction in historical centers. In some countries, they protect specific landmarks. This is what I wanted to stress. This is what we need. We need to be absolutely certain. There should be some common decision. There should be public discussion, and we need to listen to experts' opinion. Experts do know how this can be done. Yeah, we should take it up to a new level, because all cities, all towns, they're different. For some towns, we need to conserve and protect everything. And it is important to preserve the townscape and so on. But for some towns, this is too excessive, and we only need to protect certain landmarks.
Thank you. I would like to invite Mr. Gregory Ivliev, Deputy Minister of Culture of the Russian Federation.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, definitely the issue of urban policy is multifaceted. At the same time, I would like to emphasize that in the Russian Federation, we do have legislation in the area of cultural heritage protection, and it acts in the area of all cultural heritage buildings and in all towns. So I wouldn't agree with the previous speaker that it should all depend on a specific town. Towns are different in terms of maybe more strict enforcement of law. We see that in some towns, laws are not followed at all. In practice, we see that in St. Petersburg and Moscow, we do discuss issues of a new construction, and when we decide to demolish these new projects. So there is some negative flavor to it. Unfortunately, investors who were working here in the last decade or the previous decade, they were not interested in preservation of cultural heritage. And you can see, for example, on Nevsky Prospect, the main street, you can see the old facade, just one wall, which has been preserved, but behind it, there's a new building. Right now, we are implementing policy which is for preservation of all cultural monuments, and it's we have to protect everything, so we cannot choose what to protect. Now, I'm absolutely sure of it, and if we neglect to protect something, this is violation of the criminal law. Of course, we don't have enough financing for protecting everything. We don't have power and will for that, and we do not have all historical heritage registered. But we are doing this work, and in the past years, in the last decade, we see there's better regulation in this sphere, and we have a law now where we speak about historical dwellings, historical towns. And here we speak not only about historical buildings or ensembles, but within that law, we protect a wider range of components of this historical heritage. This law was adopted in 2012. And it has not become fully effective. We are only starting introducing normative acts. So 5 normative acts were introduced in 2013 and this year. So now we can say that we protect urban planning in towns, a landscape, archaeological layer, balance between different spaces in the city, spatial dimensions of historical towns. So now what is protected, the object of protection, is very diverse. So now this notion of historical dwelling is not, its task not only to identify historical and modern towns. No, it helps us to determine what we protect. Our surveys in these historical towns demonstrate that 713 towns and dwellings in Russia can be viewed as historical places that need to be preserved. So, and in each specific case, here we identify what should be protected. Even this is not enough. The Ministry of Culture has prepared a draft law, federal law, where we introduce such a notion as historical panoramas. We see now that in some regional towns that were centers of imperial Russia development, we see that the historical landscape is substituted with new quarters and buildings. The previous speaker was absolutely right when he said that we sometimes can see very strange combinations of historical and modern development, and this actually violates the townscape and historical panoramas. Right now, we have prepared draft law, and cultural heritage committees will be able to sue companies and investors not only when the building is damaged, the actual existing building is damaged, but also when the townscape and the urban environment is damaged. We need this legal mechanism because it is very difficult to prove in court that this historical townscape and panoramas are very important for cultural heritage. We do have cases like that. In Moscow, Borodino field, we had several litigations, both civil and criminal, for illegal development of that area. So we need legal mechanisms for that. So we need to forbid usage of outdoor advertising. You see that in Moscow, with our new mayor, this situation has changed, but it is still as previously in other towns, because it is very profitable to place posters and billboards on historical monuments. And Brothers Vesenin's Brothers Library, and we see a huge billboard on this historical facade, and it is from Samsung phones. This is absurd. Colleagues from the State Duma, I hope, will ban the usage of advertising on historical buildings. You know, they are trying to confuse us when they say, oh, this is wrong, so in the historical rail stations you won't be able to place any notices. No, we are not speaking about important information notices. No, information is what we all need, but advertising means money, so we don't want to allow all these commercial posters. In St. Petersburg, for example, near the Russian Museum, you can see huge posters about exhibitions which are held inside this museum, and this is fine. This informs us about this. What else is needed? We need to define what is the area of historical landmark.
Sometimes the landmark area is just defined as a regular development object or as a regular real estate, but in our legislation there is already a foundation that the territory or the area around the monument is not a regular real estate site. This is a very special real estate that should be protected according to special rules. And today, when we talk about the authority or the responsibility to protect monuments, this is not something that is vested in the construction authorities, but in the authorities that regulate cultural heritage and historical heritage. So we think this is really a correct approach. If we have to protect a site, it should be included in the real estate cadastre, but described as an individual, as special site. And right now, in all of the draft legislation, what we managed to achieve, we achieved that we will have a separate site, heritage site. We define it as the area or the territory around the monument. So we are trying to define different norms and regulations, demarcation lines and borders, and other issues. So what is actually happening in practice, because there's no solution to this issue. Usually people just treat it as a regular real estate sites. People are trying to apply for construction permits. They're trying to delete the entries to the cadastre register. You know, we have been they've been trying to eliminate the notice of the designation of a site as a historical monument. And it turns out that in the Arkhangelskaya mansion, somebody is building an assembly hall. So right now we have to demolish it, despite the fact that they've built 4 stories. So what is the problem of the law? The law does not inform the owners and the investors that it is a historical monument, a heritage site. So the investment will be more complicated, and the investments also be of a much larger volume. So if we change the law and if we clearly define what is the territory of the monuments, if we put it in the cadastre, and if there is compatibility with construction regulation, I think that we will have less lawsuits and more money invested into the restoration of historical monuments.
Since you mentioned financing as an issue, I would like to make some comments. We do have in Brazil compensation for the owner of a property that is declared cultural heritage. We have a process, an administrative process, that can also go to court if the owner of the property does not agree. It's given notice to the person, and the person has to agree or not. If the person does not agree, the person can, in 15 days, say that I don't agree, and try to argue and say that the building is not supposed to be a cultural heritage. Why is it for? Because since the property is declared cultural heritage, of course, the value of the property for the owner decreases, because nobody else will want to buy that property, because there are many rules. After the declaration of cultural heritage, there are many rules that the owner has to follow. Otherwise, there will be a penalty and a lot of things behind. I would like to know if there is, in Russia, any compensation for the owner of a private property.
Well, we do have some benefits when it comes to repairs and reconstruction. We have VAT breaks, and I can tell you that this is probably the biggest benefit and the biggest privilege that we provide to the owners of heritage sites, especially considering that restoration and renovation is very expensive. We're talking about significant amounts. But when it comes to the compensation, different types of compensation, I would say that actually we have almost no provisions there too. We have certain provisions that regulates the removal of the property from the owner, because this is cultural heritage. So when that happens, we usually compensate the owner, and we provide them with the value of the heritage site. So there is a procedure regulating that, and every owner, property owner, can has an option to receive this compensation, but the actual procedure and the budget financing of this process is unfortunately insufficient. So every time we change the ownership, we have to announce a new tender so that another owner can come and buy and purchase the property. When we talk about public obligations to protect heritage sites, although we notice a progress there, it's still not enough. During the Soviet times, when everything belonged to the governments, what happened is that there was certain depreciation of monuments, and there was no investment. So right now, I think the society as a whole has to invest into cultural heritage sites. That's why it's our policy. When we transfer the ownership to a private owner, right now we are focusing quite a lot on this. We are trying to introduce a new regulation at the federal level that says that an owner can lease or acquire ownership for just 1 ruble on the condition that within a certain time frame, say 3 or 4 years, such an owner will be able to restore the monument. That's why when we're talking about alienation from non-bona fide owner, well, this procedure does exist, but we are trying to search for new owners. And I can tell you that in the Moscow region, we can transfer the monument to a private organization for just 1 ruble so that they can restore it. I would say that this is probably going to be a prevailing policy in our activities. We have a so-called Green Corridor program, which we test run in Irkutsk when the owner does not invest the full amount into the building that is being transferred to the ownership, but say 20%. The rest of the money should be invested under the supervision of a government body into the restoration process. So once the restoration is finished, they are given full title of ownership. Before the end of this restoration, the owner does not get full title, and this is there to incentivize the owner to invest money rather quickly. Otherwise, we have a system when people take title of a heritage site, they own it for 15 years while not doing anything, so therefore we notice depreciation, while at the same time, if it's in the center of the city, the value of the property increases, so we have to compensate it at a much higher price than it used to be in the 1990s. I would also like to comment on this issue. This is a very correct subject that we are trying to cover here, because when it comes to Russia, the policy of the government, when it comes to the protection of heritage sites, it is usually built around prohibitive measures. That's why, to my mind, this is probably an approach that had a place somewhere in the past. Right now, we have to concentrate more on cooperation, interaction between all of the stakeholders. We have to find dialogue between the government and business. Therefore, the absence of compensation, especially when we designate new heritage sites, we sometimes discover that all of a sudden a building is designated as cultural heritage. Of course, the public interest prevails when it comes to the protection of heritage sites, and they should prevail over private interests. But on the other hand, since the owner loses quite a lot because of the prevalence of public interest, then I think we should really try to incentivize and compensate so that the owner doesn't lose the interest which they had vested in this site.
There's someone who wants to make a question. Let's do everything here, and then at the end, I'll let you make the questions you feel like doing. Just another comment before we continue. I have a very specific case that happened in my family. My mother-in-law has a property in Minas Gerais. It's one state in São Paulo, and the district was declared historical heritage. And of course, at the beginning, she was really mad because she wanted to sell the house. But at the end, it was a state law, because we have in the 3 levels, we have federal, state, and municipal levels, regulations about it. She had a compensation that was the right to sell the airspace. So she had a contract. The municipality gave her a contract for her to sell the airspace. So if there is a company who wants to build a skyscraper or something big, and it's not allowed to do so in the specific area, this company can buy the airspace of the house that was declared historical heritage in order to be able to build this thing that they want to. So it's another kind of compensation, and we do have, it's tax-free. If you have your house declared historical heritage, you don't pay any more taxes for the state. Does anybody else would like to make some comments about this compensation issue? One of the members of the panel, please feel free. I would like to invite Mrs. Alexandra Kazakova, Head of Legal Department of Cultural Heritage of Moscow.
Добрый день, участники.
Good day, dear participants of the forum. I'm very happy and delighted to greet you here during this important event. And of course, we are discussing a very important, a very relevant topic. How do we protect heritage sites, especially considering very rapid developments of urban environments, the needs of the society and the economy? So what sort of mechanisms can we use to attract private investments into the protection of heritage sites? How do we find the balance or the harmony to protect cultural sites in the rapidly evolving contemporary environment? First and foremost, I would like to cover several points in my presentation. I would like to tell you how Moscow participates in the restoration of heritage sites, what sort of challenges we encounter, which mechanisms we use to attract private investors to the protection of heritage sites, and what should be done in order to overcome the challenges and the problems that we face when it comes to the quality and timely execution of protection work. When it comes to the government, especially Moscow administration, Moscow city administration, how do they participate in restoration? First and foremost, they provide funding for restoration activities. We have to mention that we have a specialized cultural program in Moscow. It had been developed from 2012 to 2013, and this program is financing protection and preservation activities. So I have to underline that in 2013, the overall capitalization of restoration of cultural heritage was 17.5 billion rubles, and the share of Moscow budget was 7.5 billion rubles. But what's also important, the share of private investment was also around 7.5 billion rubles. And of course, this is not something that comes out of thin air. There was a lot of effort to achieve this from the Moscow city administration. They really put a lot of effort to increase private investments into the protection of heritage sites. So we analyzed financing of restoration work in a lot of European cities, and what we found out is that in Moscow in 2013, city administration invested 7.5 billion rubles, but such cities as Rome, Berlin, London was about 3 or 4 billion rubles. But I think that our objective is not to provide as much budgetary and public funding as we can, but our objective is to attract private investors. So here I would like to talk about the steps and the measures taken by the city administration to attract private investments. We have a program in Moscow, which the speakers already mentioned today at the roundtable discussion. It's called 1 ruble per square meter. So what is this program? Well, basically, if we have a heritage site and probably it is in a very bad shape, we transfer this object, we lease this object to a lessee. So if a lessee restores the object in the site in 5 years, then we recalculate the rent payment as 1 ruble per square meter. At the same time, this condition is true not only for the sites that are currently being transferred to ownership, but also it is valid for the sites which had previously been transferred to ownership or had been given on lease and were renovated 5 or 10 years ago. So therefore, if the title holder can provide documents that they fully restored the sites, then they are also eligible for the program. This program has been going on for 2 years. So right now we have 12 cultural sites which participated in this 1 ruble per square meter program. 2 sites have already been restored in Pechatnikov and Posodnitsky streets. So everything has been completed, and we recalculated the lease payments. But this is not all that the city administration is doing. In 2014, Moscow administration developed a new incentive when it comes to the payments for the land plot where we have commercial buildings that were rented out under this 1 ruble per square meter program. So what is the nature of this program? If the user complies with the rental agreements and all of the conditions, that instead of a cadastre value of the land plot, they do not pay for the land plot according to the cadastre value, but 1 ruble per land plot per year. This formula has been applied to one site in Pechatnikov alley, which was restored and which was also transferred under the 1 ruble per square meter rental agreements. But this, again, is not all. Currently, the city administration is also working on another framework covering the sale of heritage sites with a reverse option. It has already been made known by the city property departments of Moscow administration. And this project is trying to solve the problem. When an owner buys a heritage building and owns it for 15 years, doesn't restore it, of course, we can always undertake the measures to seize the property, but we are trying not to apply it. So what is the reverse option? The site is sold on the condition of mandatory restoration. So if during 5 years of ownership nothing is done, then the site is resold to the ownership of the Moscow city at the same price. So if the restoration work started, then it is owned by the government, but again, as security. But again, this is only being a test run. What is really important here, what is really complex, that it is really hard to find a site that is not encumbered by other titles and ownerships. But again, this is not all. I would say that the existing incentives, the existing
there are not so many of them, and we are trying to find new ideas, to look for new concepts. And one of the things that came up to us, and we are developing it, this idea is about introducing changes into the tax code. There is Article 374 of this code. It specifies properties that are exempt from taxes, and among them are historical buildings of federal significance. But if you look at it carefully, this is not absolutely fair. For example, some owner, a legal entity, so a company, they own a historical building. They do nothing with it. This building is in a very bad shape, and they don't pay any taxes. And there can be another owner who are doing all the necessary works, and they follow all the rules, and they don't pay this tax either. So we believe there should be a clarification, the qualification added, that cultural heritage buildings are exempt from taxes if they are in good shape. This will prevent us from some unfair cases. At the level of legislation, we see that there are so many collisions, and there are so many gaps. Sometimes we don't know what to do. And this is about us. And what about property owners and investors? They are absolutely lost in the sea of various contradicting norms and regulations. And that is why they are reluctant to take these historical buildings. And some time ago, the historical heritage legislation was combined with the urban development or urban planning activities. So landmarks, they have unique characteristics that cannot be changed. For example, the external look cannot be changed, and those who violate it, they can be persecuted by the criminal law. And a new norm was introduced into the historical heritage protection law. If there are some restoration works, if structural characteristics of the building are changed, then there should be state expertise evaluation of all design documentation, and also a construction permit should be obtained. This is a bit strange. If it is a historical building, then why are we speaking about a construction permit? So again, there are lots of gaps. Some organizations, they say that if we put a nail into the structural element, then it is already changes in the structure of the building, and they require this investor to go to the state expertise, which is a very lengthy and, again, complicated process. So a lot should be clarified and worked out in order to reach certainty what amounts of work are possible. As for expertise evaluation, the situation is even more complicated. There's a clear division. The federal monuments, the documents for them are reviewed by the federal expertise, and for Moscow regional buildings, Moscow expertise. But we see that in many towns there are federal monuments, so they never submit design packages to the federal expertise, because the state expertise doesn't accept such projects if financing is provided by local budgets. So what happens then? So it happens that developers, they call their project restoration, but actually they are reconstructing these buildings, and no one knows how safe these works are and who will be responsible for that. So we believe that this should be delegated to the federal, from the federal to the regional level. So regional authorities need to be able to do this state expertise evaluation of various projects. I can speak about many other examples, and this will be very long, but I would like to touch upon one type of problems. This is fire safety and preservation tasks. I can give you a very simple example. For example, cultural landmark. Of course, these buildings, they are used, some are used for cultural and social purposes, some are administrative buildings. In terms of fire protection, there should be a second entrance or exit. But in terms of preservation of cultural heritage, we cannot change the outlook of the building. There is a clause that there can be special technical requirements for a specific building, but this is very expensive. Such special requirements may cost, their preparation may cost about 200,000 rubles, but usually these organizations are budget financed, and they don't have this money, so there should be some changes And fire safety regulation never considers the idea of preservation of cultural heritage. So there should be streamlining of technical safety regulations and cultural preservation regulation. Apart from the preservation and restoration works, there are many other methods used by the government in order to preserve and harmonize landmarks. This is various constraints for new construction, development of various protected zones. In Moscow, for example, in 2012, we developed a program of height constraints, and it is not possible to build anywhere in Moscow, to build buildings higher than 75 meters. But this norm is effective only for new construction, not for buildings that had been built before. In Moscow, when a new project is going to be built, this is always approved by the mayor, and there's a special committee discussing this. And one more thing used by the government. This is a punitive method, and we try to make investors do what they are supposed to. And this is various penalties, oversight, and even taking away this building from the investors. So we try to develop new stimulating measures in order to attract more investments into the area of cultural heritage protection. So this is our main task. Thank you very much.
Since you mentioned legislation gaps, I would like to know whether it's common that issues regarding heritage sites go to court in Russia.
It is not so many different types of lawsuits. So usually this is when there are some annexes or some extra wings added to historical heritage. Then there are suits when we try to enforce certain works. And sometimes, and this is a new practice, and in Moscow there were only two decisions when two cultural buildings were taken away from owners who were not doing what they were supposed to. So only two cases in Moscow. And one of them is a building, it is in very bad shape, and okay, there is a court decision, but nothing is happening. And the second case, it was a regional monument, a landmark, and it was purchased by the city treasury, by Moscow Treasury, and now the city leased it, and it cost only 1 ruble per square meter. So I cannot say that we have a very wide practice of lawsuits in this area, but we try to work on it, and we try to get positive practice. Thank you.
Does anybody else would like to make any comments?
Я бы хотел один момент.
I would like to add one more thing. Yeah, the colleague was absolutely right when she was speaking about development of historical towns. I mean, this approach, what we can do or cannot do with it. Yeah, and I would like to stress again this problem that right now we have absolutely the same technical norms, both for new buildings and for historical buildings. Yeah, these technical and construction norms, they should be adjusted and differentiated for these different types of buildings. And of course, you can request require a second exit from the building, but if it is a historical monument, then there should be an exemption from that. I would like to comment on behalf of the Ministry of Construction, because there were some complaints about our work. Yes, we should differentiate new construction projects and historical projects, but in terms of functionality of the building, if you plan to use a historical building for administrative purposes, then we need to take care of fire safety. If you believe that in terms of historical preservation, it is not allowed to have the second entrance, then this building should be used for another purpose, because if we have so many people inside this building, then we do need a second exit. And I cannot agree with my colleague from Moscow that there are certain collisions, and she mentioned this construction permit. This is in line with the construction code of the Russian Federation. If there is reconstruction, not restoration works, but reconstruction works, and this means introducing changes into the structural elements of the building, then yes, you need to develop a structural engineering package, and there should be analysis how this will affect this building. Yeah, and there should be a construction permit, and you will be controlled by oversight bodies. Yes, and you will have to get a construction permit. So I do not understand how this contradicts the idea of protecting the historical building. We are speaking about safety regulations. Yeah, and it's not about restoration. It is only when we have reconstruction works, only then it is needed. As for expertise evaluation at the regional level and the federal level, GOS expertise, it is not only in Moscow, it has its branches, and it is again in line with the law. If you need, there should be changes, then let's do it. What should be within the competence of federal bodies and regional bodies. And if you are saying that you do certain works in federal monuments, then the Ministry of Culture should take certain decisions. And if we speak about regional landmarks, then ROS expertise doesn't take any part in evaluating these design packages. Thank you very much.
To invite Mr. Semyon Mikhailovsky, Rector of St. Petersburg Institute of Fine Arts, Sculpture and Architecture.
Спасибо. Добрый день.
Thank you. Good afternoon. We have been spoken a lot from the point of a legal perspective. I would like to move our discussion into a more free, general discussion. We speak a lot about cultural heritage preservation, and I believe this should be discussed in line with development of towns. And we need to consider not only that regulation that exists, but also some experience of developing historical buildings. The experience that cannot be ignored by us. In fact, what we have heard now, all these arguments, yeah, it is quite interesting. So we, in our academy, we are in the historical building, which was built in the middle of the 18th century. And, sometimes here, these fire safety regulations, they're so absurd that I sometimes think maybe we need to be used for other purposes. And yes, what Alexandra Mikhailovna from the Moscow government was speaking about, yes, we always come across these problems, yeah, and we can protect the position, we can explain the position of various agencies and committees, but still it is a serious problem, and it is very relevant and of immediate nature, and it is our everyday life in St. Petersburg, for example. So I believe all the system of constraints and limitations, for a long time we had all these activists. It was like even a political or civil movement to protect St. Petersburg. And largely that was a demonstration of civil activity, and it was important to involve general public into it. But after some time, it all moved into another area. Now it is politics already, and the community of experts in the area of cultural heritage protection, they are members of various councils. Okay, their role is enormous, and their decisions are extremely important. And if originally this was a civil movement, and now they actually determine how buildings will be used and how architecture will live in future. Well, on the one hand, this is a positive thing, but on the other hand, it is not so straightforward because, okay, urban planning, there are different groups, okay, and the state tries to put certain constraints for participation of business in this. Then there are experts community, and they protect their own interests, and this is a known fact. Then there's architectural community. They also have their own interests, and yeah, there are so many councils and committees where you need to get approvals. Yeah, this is like an elite club you cannot get into, and they develop on their own. So all these forces, they oppose each other, but at the same time, the city should be developing. The city actually absorbs everything. We have two models here. So the Brazilian colleagues can confirm. Yeah, so we have a good model of these Soviet type, socialist type planning, like Nemiro and other towns. But people are not very happy to live in such towns because these are like dead cities. Maybe I'm wrong, but I at least I see those projects by Nemiro. And then there's Venice. So sometimes we call St. Petersburg the northern Venice. No, we are not Venice, and we cannot limit construction and forbid any construction here like in Venice. No, it is not a good thing for us. So we have a very strange position in terms of architecture. Okay, there are zones, and using these zones, we try to cover, okay, the central part. But why are we doing? We close any construction in the central part. And what do we see? That bad architecture goes back to the outskirts, to the peripheral part. And as for the Gazprom tower, people wanted it, or the project itself was not very nice. We were trying to move it to the outskirts, but this is not good for those areas where this project will be implemented.
Then again, we were trying to shift to the outskirts, but nobody was discussing the quality of the building. We were just discussing the impact it has on the city of St. Petersburg. So that's why when we think about architecture, we are not really that concerned with it. We are discussing the issues related to architecture, but actually we are talking about where the building should be located, whereas we should focus more on the architecture, on the qualitative characteristics of a building, instead of discussing the influence on the environment. So I think here we have to find a balance, and we have to set the right tone of the architectural discussion. So it does. So it's not an intervention into heritage cities. It is dangerous, but on the other hand, we cannot fully conserve cities, removing all of the stimuli for development. The development of infrastructure sometimes was done against nature, against common sense, against the circumstances. So it was done against something. So the building where we are currently in, and you see how the corner is facing the Moika embankments. I can said that this again is the madness of Carlo Rossi and the Russian Empire, which actually won the imperial struggle with Napoleon. But, this is quite a nice building, but actually, when we protect, we should protect. If we're talking about the Isaac cathedrals, it was built Maternove, then Rinaldi, then demolished by Rinaldi, and so on and so forth. So we shouldn't approach it willingly. We have a certain set of regulations, but at the same time, we should not be entrapped by this regulation. We have to find a balance between common sense, between agency-level regulations, between all of the challenges and the problems that we encounter on a day-to-day basis, at least by saying we, I mean people who have common sense and work in the area of preservation. I think in the end we do find a solution and a compromise, but sometimes, unfortunately, it is not the best solution and probably not even worthy of discussion and debate. So I would say that there is a lot of confusion and the lack of productive cooperation in this area. But I'm concerned that we're not really talking about architecture at all. We're not talking about urban architecture, about design, urban design. So we're not discussing any of these issues. For some reason, we think that these topics are secondary, but they shouldn't be. If we look at Paris, you see all of a sudden, we have pyramids there in the middle of Paris. I don't like it personally, but it was integrated organically into the bigger Louvre complex. So it's a commercial zone, but the pyramids are there and everything is quite fine. But I can tell you, if we were trying to do something here, we would have to, massive rallies on our hands, people with foam on their mouth, but very fanatical populations. But I can tell you, when we are talking about business, sometimes we have expert communities. When we talk about the Babur Center in Paris, as you know, this is a historical part of the city. How was it done? How was it possible? But the building is there, and it became not just one of the elements of the architecture of the 20th century, but also a major museum center. It is a public space visited by millions of people. There are a lot of exhibitions of contemporary art, so this is really useful and creates a lot of benefits. So I think the experience of Paris is similar to the experience of other cities. We have to take into account. Otherwise, I'm concerned about two things. First of all, of course, we have Moscow with absolutely maddening pace of construction during Lushkov's years, which is now thankfully being slowed down. On the other hand, we have St. Petersburg, where we tend to conserve and preserve everything. That is why all of the limitations that are imposed by the regulations are limiting the actual cities. The city is becoming closed off. At the same time, we have these insane ideas about creating pedestrian and recreational areas. But, we have huge problems with the traffic in the city center, and all of a sudden we're talking about creating nothing but pedestrian zones. So for me, it's not really self-evident, but it is an important component of the urban environment. And I think that conservation is probably not the best solution. What I am trying to say is that we have to find a balance between all of the stake players, the government, which is delivering preferential treatments and imposing restrictions, as my colleagues have said. Of course, the intentions are really good. They give opportunities to business to take part in this process, and I really hope that it will be implemented. But on the other hand, we have business community with a lot of accountability, both when it comes to the cities and the society, especially in terms of preservation of historical sites. But unfortunately, we do not have many successful examples of such cooperation. I think that we have to hold businesses accountable for the preservation of monuments and heritage sites, but like I said, unfortunately, there are not many successful examples. That is why what I'm saying here today is mostly questions. Unfortunately, I cannot give you many answers, and I don't think anybody can. All of the people who work on theoretical urban development, they all offer different models, but I would say that all of these models are not ideal because the architecture reflects the society life, like the buildings built by Mayor Lushkov, they are reflecting the age, the epoch, so they are there as monuments to the management style. They are the monuments to the age of postmodernity. We can like it, we can hate it, but architecture should continue to evolve. The issue is who is going to be responsible for the evolution. And here again, we encounter a number of other issues. We have to talk about education in the field of architecture. We have to talk about real competitiveness. We have to underline how important it is to allow architects participation in this process, while at the same time making sure that we have open competitiveness on the market, because our architecture is dictated by political will, economical conditions, and so this is the only way to go. But unfortunately today, when we talk about architecture, I can tell you that we haven't heard a lot of opinions about architecture. I don't remember hearing any opinions about architecture, whether it's good or bad, importance or not. Again, we do not hear anything from the governments about the architecture and art. Maybe this is a good sign, because we are not being dictated in what sort of environment we have to conform to. But I think on the other hand, I think there would be interest to actually receive some feedback.
I would like to ask just one thing. Would you think it would be a more fair process if the urban planning would take into account the citizens' opinion instead of only this elite club that you mentioned decision-making process?
What you're saying about the citizens' opinion, I can tell you that it is actually very important, the opinion of the community, the opinion of the people. The people shouldn't be managed by the expert club or the politicians, but instead given an opportunity to give direct feedback and to deliver their opinions, so that they have tools and the mechanisms to give their opinions. But what I think that, well, at least in St. Petersburg, the people lost a lot of enthusiasm when it comes to the preservation of monuments in the 1980s. So this topic, which was very relevant in the 1980s, and it was even becoming public, a societal movement, I can tell you that what we have as a result in 2014, it lost its topicality, its urgency. So right now people are mostly focusing on their own personal interests and objectives. And if we talk about a social movement, the way we had in the 1980s, then I have to say that today it's almost non-existent. That is why preservation of heritage sites is more or less a card joker, because it's a good subject. So actually what happens is that a lot of people talk about architecture. They talk about the preservation of heritage sites and monuments, but it loses its meaning. It just becomes an empty definition. But I do think that it exists, and I myself witnessed how Director Mershan Sakurov was actively participated in the debate about the demolition of the building on the Zagorodny Prospect. This is Rogov's house, which was in a very bad state. It was being depreciated, and of course, it is true that we contributed a lot to the deplorable state of the building, and in the end, it was demolished, which of course wasn't a right thing to do. But what he said was that Pushkin used to drive in a carriage past this house. So we shouldn't have demolished it, but I don't think this is a good argument to say that who used to pass by the building. This is probably not the right way to put it. But of course, the fate of the building, the fate of the Rogov building was of concern. If you remember, when we built a horrible mall on the Vladimirskaya Square, it's actually completely destroyed the environments, and because they built a huge commercial building right opposite the cathedral, I think that was a crime against the cities. But when we talk about the demolition of a small three-story building, that was mostly probably illegal matter, a violation, but not as the destruction of the city. So when we talk about St. Petersburg, we do not really have destruction in the city. We have very strict regulations, a lot of corporate interest when it comes to the preservation of heritage. Sorry, it takes a long time, so much time, but this is how it is. I think that the regulations that we have in St. Petersburg are very stringent. I do believe that they should be there, but at the same time, we have to give a breath of fresh air to the architecture, a bit of freedom, because as you know, there is progress and evolution. As it might seem strange to you, but I do believe that Gazprom could have been in St. Petersburg, maybe even a skyscraper, maybe even next to this Smolny, but I do believe that it should have been done on a very good design project. I would just say that the actual design was pretty bad. Thank you very much. If you'd allow me, I would like to comment on the issue. I would like to talk about public interest when it comes to the preservation of monuments. Since we work on preservation of monuments in Moscow and our department is doing a lot of work, we do feel that the public is not indifferent, so that the public is very proactive when it comes to the preservation of heritage sites. So I would say that we don't have a single large-scale project where the public doesn't take a part. And if we talk about doing anything in Moscow, I can tell you that everything is under such public scrutiny that you cannot really do much, and you cannot really hide anywhere. That's why we introduced an innovation. We introduced a mobile app which is called Proactive Citizen. So all of the important decisions that are made in Moscow in the social sphere, not just in the preservation of monuments, people can download the app and they can vote, whether express their support, say yes or no. That's why we take the citizens' opinion into account when we're making decisions. Again, what we are going to do using this app next, we are going to involve the public into the discussion of tax regulations.
Application thing, it's very good. Now I'd like to invite Elena Sigerra, Deputy Minister of Construction Industry, Housing and Utilities Sector of the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much. Dear participants of the forum, actually I prepared a slightly different presentation, but since we have such an emotionally charged debate here, let me change it a little bit. I would like to tell you that I was born and I grew up in Moscow, but another part of my family are people from Barcelona, where they really preserve historical monuments. I can tell you that in the 1990s, when I was witnessing the destruction and demolition of historical monuments, I was suffering quite a lot looking at my city. And again, I do not agree with a lot of modern construction. I live on Goncharny Street in the district of Taganka. This is probably one of the oldest human settlements in Moscow. And we managed to preserve quite a lot of monuments there, but unfortunately, not a lot of these monuments are in a good condition. There is a lot of depreciation. But I also do know about a lot of work that the city administration is doing. I know that there is a lot of criticism about the activities in the 1990s, but let us think about the overall state of the country in the 1990s. Let's think about what sort of challenges we faced in the 1990s as a country. And if we are talking about these issues, if we're talking about urban developments, I would agree by saying that we should not actively pursue conservation. Certainly, there are certain cities that can be treated as heritage sites, but here we run into another problem. When I talked to the governor of Nizhny Novgorod, he was at a loss. He didn't know what to do with really worn out housing buildings. And the buildings were in a very bad state, but at the same time, Gorky, who is a Russian writer, used to drink tea here, and he visited this or that building. That's why everything that's in the historical center should be preserved and conserved, because somebody sometime set a foot in the building. But how are we going to tackle the problem of urban developments, traffic developments, engineering and utilities infrastructure, the comfort of living standards? Again, this is an issue of urban development. This is an issue of infrastructure. We have a lot of positive examples at the same time. For instance, Sergiev Posad, when they were celebrating the anniversary of Sergei Radonezhsky, they made a decision, and this decision, again, is related to what the first speaker was saying. He was saying that the cities and towns are being developed chaotically. This is not true. We do have master plans for developments, and I see in the audience my colleague from the Ministry of Regional Development, and he is working on these issues. There is a master development plan which is only passed through public debate. So I think that the quality of these master plans, and I should underline that all of the settlements and towns and cities have to pass master plans in the Russian Federation. And again, the towns where we have historical sites and monuments, these master plans in these towns should be ratified by a federal body. And despite what our colleagues from the regions are saying, I should say that a lot of historical monuments have been preserved only because these master plans are ratified in the Ministry of Culture. So to give you a positive example, to go back to it, I would like to give an example of Sergiev Posad. They decided to build a new district a bit closer to Moscow, so they can relocate people from old houses to a new, more comfortable living conditions. And where they used to live, what they're going to do, they're going to open a lot of museums, a lot of tourist attractions. So I think these plans also have a right to exist, because again, we should not conserve everything. Should we turn the center of Moscow, St. Petersburg into an open-air museum? Then what are we going to get in the end? We are talking about cities, the cities which are evolving and developing. So I agree with the rector of the Fine Arts Academy. I don't like the Eiffel Tower, but look, it became a symbol of Paris.
But I don't like it from a structural point of view. It's not beautiful. This is my personal opinion, but it is there, and it is a symbol of Paris. The Sevier Cathedral in Moscow, it was It was built on the place where there used to be an old monastery, and now we have a new savior because during the Soviet time it was demolished and there was a swimming pool. So we all take up our own decisions when we discuss urban development plans. I don't like when we see so many pedestrian streets in Moscow, for example. We are not in Brazil, so we have a very cold climate. So I don't understand why we need so many pedestrian streets, because it's so cold in winter to get to walk to work, and I don't ride a bike. So all this should be discussed by everyone when we discuss master plans, when we plan how this area will be developed. I would like to stress that safety is important, and this safety should be regulated. This is not restoration. If there are changes into the structure of the buildings, we never interfere how restoration works should be done. And we shouldn't speak about ministry interests. No. We don't try to promote something only we need. No, safety regulation is important, and fire requirements, fire protection requirements. This is important when people die if there is a fire. This is very bad. So unfortunately, all these requirements, they are based on people's lives that were lost. So, and all this is based on various laws. And I should say that we supported the law which was drafted by the Cultural Ministry, where they specify what is a landmark. For example, Kolomenskoye village near Moscow. So in the area of this village, about 60 buildings that were built by people without any permits. That is a reserve, and with all those structures, that landmark, that natural reserve, was turned into a slump. And now we have cleared up this area, and it's a big park, and it's very good for people, and they take their children for a walk there. And this landmark continues working for us, for people. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would love to make comments on Eiffel Tower, but we would need another panel for that. So I do hope that you are going to be able to develop the city, preserving the historical sites, because it's really beautiful. I love it, Moscow. I love it, St. Petersburg. I'm a big fan now. Let's move on because of the time, and I know that many people would like to make questions. I would like to invite Victoria Tessitrina, Head of Legal Department at Alon Group. I don't know what I'm saying.
Добрый день, коллеги.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this forum. I would like to support my colleague, Alexander Arseniev, and to continue talking about it from the point of view of the business people, because developers now are those people who implement into practice all these projects. Speaking about these cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, when we initiate any project, of course, we start with analyzing the area where we are going to build and what we are going to build, and whether there's cultural heritage preservation requirements. The legislation, yes, is vast here, but there are different paths there. On the one hand, we evaluate the past heritage, and on the other hand, we determine the future life. And if there are no constraints, like servitudes for using certain areas and zones, still there are lots of gaps in terms of public utilities and engineering infrastructure and social functions. And take into account those facts that the way from initiating the project and preparation of the design documentation and to getting of the construction permit, it takes about 12 to 18 months. Actually, this project may undergo lots of changes, and very often this changes the project totally. I'm speaking about identification or registration of new monuments. It was very nice to hear from the cultural ministry that all these notions will be finalized and determined in the law. For example, we had a case when a certain building 60 years ago, it was decided that it was not a landmark anymore, but then it was returned. So we hope that all this will be fixed and there will be no more changes. And when we start implementation of the project, very often norms are changed. And for example, now, when we hear that there will be changes into the zones, protected zones, so for us it is quite problematic. We don't know how this will affect us. And all these documents related to the area of whole St. Petersburg development, all these notions, development and preservation. Yeah, so because development can be viewed in a way as preservation as well. So we need clear definitions and absolute certainty in this area. Right now, we don't have mechanisms for a construction of social infrastructure projects on the part of the city. It is not fixed, is not regulated by any of the laws. So, and this very often is linked to what investors are doing, and this contributes into attractiveness of the urban area in general. So I believe there should be coordination between activities of authorities and business people, and this relates to all these issues of clear definitions and also our vision how the area should be developed. And I believe PPP partnerships, public and private partnerships, yeah, this can be used for larger projects. For example, not just one building, but several buildings within one block. And I believe this might be very interesting, not only for private investors, but for large companies who would like to enter this market. And of course, we need to say that there should be some optimization of construction procedures. This work is being done, and it's very good that we see positive results. Now we have fewer procedures, yeah, and we hope that next year we can discuss even further positive results of this. Thank you very much.
I would like to invite now Justice Armando Sérgio Prado de Toledo, Special Assistant to the President of São Paulo State Court of Justice.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. After excellent exhibitions, I will talk little in English and leave more to the moderator. And I will ask to the moderator if she could be my translator, my support after my quick reading in English. Sure. Basically, the property is a constitutional right in Brazil, guaranteed by the Constitution, and the right of a property is guaranteed, Article 5 and number 22. There may be limitations of the use of a property according to specific regulations in federal, state, and municipal levels. The Constitution foresees in Article 23 and 216 the property issues. 23, the Union, the states, the federal district, and the municipalities in common have the power to promote housing construction, progress, and the improvement of housing and basic sanitation constitution. And the Article 216, the Brazilian cultural heritage consists of the sets of a material and the immaterial nature, taken individually or as a whole, which make reference to the identity, action, and memory of the various groups that from the Brazilian society. And Brazil has a law to regulate urban policy. The law 10,257 by 201 is the Statute of Cities. Examples of historic places declared patrimonialized by the UNESCO in Brazil, we have Brasília, and the Christ and Rio de Janeiro, the proper building of the just building and São Paulo Court of Justice, and the city Ouro Preto. And I continue now in Portuguese, and my respected moderator, I go to do a personal observations. I would like to então dizer que gostaria que você trouxesse casos como os que vêm para o tribunal, onde as pessoas que querem modificar casas para vender, porque não está de uma forma comercial, por estar tombada, vamos dizer, e o problema dos custos da manutenção e para que se mantenha a casa restaurada, o que acaba, em verdade, sendo vendido por preço muito baixo e para fundações ou o próprio governo assume, né?
Now he would like to address the issues that go to court regarding the financing of the historic sites and the decisions that the court has to make regarding this, and when people don't agree, and the decisions he's going to make comments on decisions that him as a justice at the São Paulo Court of Justice has seen.
E o problema, né, que esse custo acaba sendo vendido muito barato para fundações ou para o próprio governo do estado, né?
Yeah, because of the decreasing of price, most of the time the foundations and the government are the ones that buy those properties.
Outro ponto que nós enxergamos negativo no Brasil com relação a essa questão, por exemplo, no CONDEFAT, em virtude da necessidade de autorização, o próprio tribunal demorou 6 anos para ter autorização para poder fazer sua restauração. E com isso houve muito mais aumento nos problemas que já vinham apresentando.
One negative point in Brazil is that the lack of time to get an authorization to make the restoration of historical buildings like the Court of Justice. It's a big issue because it took for the São Paulo Court of Justice 6 years in order to get the authorization. And during this period, what happened is that the cost, of course, increased because the things were deteriorating even more.
E mudando um pouco de assunto, eu tenho percebido que na Europa a preservação é feita de uma forma extremamente inteligente, porque se mantém o aspecto externo e moderniza-se internamente os prédios, aqueles que mereçam essa preservação, coisa que no Brasil não existe, porque por ser um país novo com relação à Europa, não existe ainda essa cultura intensa de preservação.
A very positive point that he sees in Europe is that the restoration is a very smart process because the restoration is outside, but inside of the buildings they are very modern. And in Brazil we don't have this thing nowadays because Brazil is a very new country and we are starting with this thing of cultural heritage and restoration recently.
Apesar de uma legislação muito boa a respeito.
Even though we have a very good legislation about it.
Mas não se tem dúvida da importância de mantermos a história de nossos povos estampado ao longo do tempo, pelos nossos antepassados. Ou seja, eu não tenho dúvida e não temos dúvida nenhuma de que é fundamental mantermos a história que se estampou nas nossas cidades pelos nossos antepassados durante os anos que houve essa evolução.
There is no doubt about the necessity of keeping the memory, the history of our people, of the past in our city and everywhere.
E o mais já foi dito aqui, eu agradeço muito.
He says "Spasiba," and the rest has been already said by
Thank
everybody.
you so much.
I would like to thank everyone. It was a real honor to be the moderator of this panel, certainly one of the best that I have ever taken part. Thank you so much. And I would like to allow people to make questions if you feel like. Is there a microphone that we can use?
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Большое спасибо за...
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for these detailed presentations. I'm from the legal faculty of St. Petersburg State University. I have very pragmatic questions to Mr. Ivlev and Mrs. Kazakova. Question to Mr. Kazakov. You mentioned compensations to owners. Yes, there is compensation for those owners who preserve and fulfill all the requirements. But for all of us, for lawyers, this is a mystery. Every couple of years, we state that, again, implementation of this is postponed to the future. Right now, it is planned to make this effective in 2016. So it's not quite clear from the point of view of the regulator. So do you believe that this was an excessive measure, and maybe the Ministry of Culture supports the regulator and these mechanisms for stimulating owners is not within this cultural heritage preservation law, but in the tax regulation? This was my question number one. And the second question, we have spoken a lot about cultural preservation, and Mr. Ivlev, yeah, he was speaking about these outrageous cases on Nevsky, for example, when only the facade wall has been preserved and everything else has been changed. As far as I know, in the country, there are no methodology guidelines how to determine what is preserved. This is usually determined by experts. And as far as I know, state agencies, they cannot do cultural expertise evaluation themselves. So this is done by experts, and then it is approved by the agencies. What about Ministry of Culture? Can you prepare certain methodological guidelines how to determine the object of preservation, this cultural heritage definition? And one question for Moscow government. I believe that Mosgornasledia, this Moscow Heritage Committee, is one of the most, it's one of the best in Russia. And it's good that you have introduced the form of heritage preservation agreement. On my part, I support this. I believe, yeah, it shouldn't be in line with the civil law and transaction regulation. I would like to ask you, are there any changes in lawsuits related to this preservation agreement? So is it becoming better or not?
Thank you very much for your question. But if we're talking about unilateral responsibility to preserve, then here again, we're not trying to make it mandatory. We can only talk about mandatory measures when we're talking about federal banks, which still kept the bilateral procedures when it is formalized as a contract between the preservation body and the title holder. But I can tell you that currently we do have such lawsuits. They are being filed, but we do not use this practice proactively. We don't want to spend too much time or too much human resources on it. But again, I think it is really, really hard to implement. Even if we make it mandatory, it is extremely hard to implement. That is why we are not really actively implementing this practice. So we are mostly trying to combat illegal construction and property seizures, but still we see the applications to protect public interests. Well, I have two questions. In the Article 14, I think, creates a lot of headache for us. At the same time, you shouldn't view legislators as, people who just make a decision, nod and everything is done. I would say that the legislator is a beast with many heads. Sometimes we pursue different interests in different areas. So Article 14 has been introduced, but unfortunately receives no funding. So for a number of years, we've been offering different funding schemes, such as limiting funding schemes, percentage-based schemes, compensations of, say, 5% from the cost of restorations. But again, what will happen by 2016? Whether we will have a legislator who will cancel this norm, or maybe we'll have a legislator who will still pursue additional schemes of financing. If you're talking about experts and experts review, I have to say that first and foremost, this is scientific research. And when we talk about administrative regulation of scientific research, again, this is extremely complicated, so we are not regulating it. When we do qualification review of the experts, we usually see what they've done. We look at their research papers. That's why every time we review each heritage site and its preservation on a case-by-case basis. Once we encounter differences, or when we encounter differences, we usually present it to the scientific committee. So if you remember the reconstruction of the Pushkin Museum, this issue has been viewed 2 or 3 times, and still no consensus, no compromise has been found. Again, if we're talking about science and research, how it will progress, I think this is a question that we should ask or pose to our educational institutions. We also finance it and look at it in more detail. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Ekaterina Lizanova from Tomsk, from a legal firm, and I'm also chairwoman of the committee for the Union of Construction Companies. So as you know, Tomsk is celebrating an anniversary this year, and there are lots of monuments and heritage sites. But of course, being lawyers, we're mostly concerned with the status of historical monuments. We really love our cities. We know all of the heritage and cultural sites. But again, there are a lot of issues with Soviet time monuments and with Soviet time heritage. As you all know, a lot of the monuments were designated as historical without any sort of expert review. So my question is, do you think that there will be a set timeline or a time frame for the monuments that were designated as historical before we passed the cultural and heritage sites legislation? You know, all of these sites should be entered into the register, but as we see, years have gone by, but still a lot of monuments are not part of the register, while still being protected by this law. But we run into a lot of practical application issues. So for instance, sometime the monument was demolished, maybe even legally demolished, but at the same time we still have a title to this real estate, since it wasn't registered, it wasn't entered into the register, but it is governed by the law. That is why it needs a government decree to remove it from the register. or to remove the title from the register. That's why we have a certain collision. Being lawyers, we usually believe if there is no real estate, if there is no monument, then no title issue arises. The question is, so when we're talking about the review, the demolition review, why can't it be used as evidence of factual loss of the building? So why do we have a state expert and state historical review in order to state the fact that the monument is no longer there? Well, to answer your question, I can say this is a multifaceted situation. So when we talk about practical side of things, I can tell you that I have not signed a single document about removing any monuments from the register, because this way we will create a precedent. If we demolish a monument and there was a building that was erected on the site, and there are people who have been living there for 18 years in a building that hasn't been properly registered. So the question is, should we provide the foundations to these people? But again, we have a way to protect heritage sites, and usually we're talking about rebuilding or recreating the heritage sites. So this is not the actual building which is to be, but as you see, we have a number of examples. We rebuilt Christ the Savior's Cathedral in Moscow, a lot of monuments in Kolomensk. So there is another way of existence of the urban environment, of the urban development. So I can see that there are a number of cases, but first and foremost, we have to consider the issue of rebuilding. Of course, to demolish a building, usually it has a lot of associated costs, but if the demolition is needed, it should happen. I can tell you that in Pskov, they built an administrative building of the Communist Party, which is obscuring the view of the Pskov Kremlin. So I can tell you that if you look at it right now, you see that there is a brickwork house that has been there for a number of years. So people do believe that once they've built it, then nothing can be done. But again, when we talk about the status of the additional 2 or 3 stories, it is not a legal status. So I do think we will probably buy out this property and finance it through government schemes so that we can relocate the people and demolish additional floors, because they're obscuring not just the landscape, but they're obscuring the sites of spiritual heritage. I believe that spiritual heritage is yet another type of cultural heritage. As you know, my colleagues today mentioned different images, literary or emotional perceptions. But I can tell you that we are the generation who grew up looking at nearly demolished cathedrals and churches, but you're a different generation. You saw them being restored. So that's why we're different generations. We have different perceptions, and you can usually feel it in the decisions that are being made. We can say that the dacha of Ageev burned down, so let's build a mall there. But we usually contradict such people by saying, let's rebuild this dacha. This is a brilliant example of the Moscow region architecture. And we read about this dacha life in the works of Chekhov and Gorky. There is something that we've lost there. That's why I think that if the monument is destroyed, it should not be removed from the registry of cultural and heritage sites. We can always rebuild it. And I think it also creates an independent cultural value. It enriches our life. I can tell you that there were several decisions like this made in the recent years, but again, the Ministry of Culture does not support any proposals to demolish or destroy heritage sites. If we give in, then the house of Taras Shevchenko in Orenburg will cease to exist. Although they did prove that Shevchenko was never there. He maybe just walked by. But we usually counter them by saying that this is a 19th century wooden house, and you have not many of such houses left in Orenburg. So that's why when we are trying to preserve and save such a complicated monument, it turns out that we can give it on a lease to the bank. They can open an office there and still enjoy associated cultural heritage. That's why we are against removing of any monuments from the cultural register. And I think that our children will decide what to do about it. I will try to be brief, but I would like to find out more detail. Do you think that there is any sort of regulatory time frame to review the application from the municipality about the removal of a cultural heritage site from the registry? Again, when we're talking about well-known and spiritual sites, I agree with you, but sometimes if we're talking, sometimes we have strange sites. For instance, when they discovered a deposit of natural resources in Tomsk, we were told, can you please find a building where a famous geologist lived? But again, once the site has been fully destroyed and the urban planning committee considers its demolition for safety reasons, then the investors cannot really use this site, since it is a historical site. And I know that there have been a lot of applications like this. We've been sending them to the Ministry of Culture, but receiving no response. And another issue is about informing potential owners and investors about the status of the sites. Again, all the sites that were not entered into the registry, I can tell you that there is a lot of confusion there. If the Department of Culture, say, in the Russian region, if they express the will, they can send an application to the Ministry of Culture. Sometimes they forget to do that, and then the owner comes, they send an application to the registry, they find that it is unencumbered in any way, they sometimes send a query to the Ministry of Culture. And then, of course, the Department of Culture would always provide them with a response. They will cite a regulatory act, but then what can we do with it in the future? Well, of course, when it comes to designated heritage sites, we find quite a lot of violations there in the regions. But when it comes to the time frame and the deadline, it is usually being observed. So sometimes if your query did not receive a response, just tell us about it. We'll do everything we can. And again, with the monuments that have been designated as cultural and heritage sites, I can tell you that any decision that was made back in the Soviet times is absolutely legally valid. If we enter the monuments into the register, then I can tell you that sometimes we receive a lot of applications from the regions. Sometimes we're talking about 1,500 of monuments that should be entered into the registry. So we will have to apply a lot of efforts. But as you know, expert review requires quite a lot of knowledge, not to mention the funding. And I do agree with you that sometimes the situation is not clear, but then again, you can always talk to the courts, and usually people ask them how many court proceedings we have. I can tell you that there are court proceedings in each and every region of the Russian Federation. Sometimes even when we see small cities or tiny settlements, the problems still remain the same. They're trying to demolish heritage sites and not preserve them. I think that there is a trend for modern construction, but not preservation. But unfortunately, this is the reality.
This could be the last one.
Меня зовут Татьяна Бражник.
My name is Tatiana Brazhnik from the Higher School of Economics, the Faculty of Law in Moscow. I had a lot of practical issues. Our building is a historical site located in the Tretyakovskaya district, but let me shift it more to a theoretical field. So we're talking about finding a balance between public, private, business interests and the interests of the owner. Again, this is a very subjective issue. When we talk about, there are a lot of subjective parameters, there are a lot of judgments. So do you think, are there any mechanisms that we can use to achieve objectivity? For instance, the applications which, the mobile phone application which launched in Moscow actually allows the public to participate, therefore achieve objectivity. So either is there an international or maybe Russian experience to achieve objectivity. Maybe the Ministry of Culture has programs that would allow us to establish an objective mechanism. Unfortunately, we do not have any mechanisms. So usually it is up to the monument preservation authorities. So whatever decision they make, this is the decision we have to follow. But of course, we are not really free in making our decisions. We have a professional community. We have a committee with membership of the best experts and professionals, and we always consult the professional community. They are very stringent in their review. So when we're talking about St. Petersburg, there is the City for Living organization in St. Petersburg. So I can tell you that they really provide us with a lot of support. There are a lot of measures to preserve heritage and cultural sites, so we do not see many contradictions there. Maybe we can say that there is a certain competition, say, between Moscow Naslediye on the Ministry of Culture. We sometimes might state that we do more to protect the monuments than public organizations, but usually public organizations, they have more freedom and different perspectives. But I think they are our supporters, they're our allies, so sometimes we use their position to provide, human perspective. I would also like to add that I'm absolutely convinced that this is a very subjective process, and we cannot really concern it with architecture. Again, when we talk about good architecture, first and foremost, this is a convergence of circumstance, which is the will, the possibility, the capability, and the desire to do so. So going back to the Gazprom building, I would like to say this is a large corporation, and they had a right to build a large building. They had a tender. They invited all of the star place, but unfortunately it wasn't the best architectural project that won. That's why this story wasn't successful. Had they done it on a different level, had they invited and other architects, they would have generated more interest for the project. They would have found more public support. They would have consolidated the society around this project. So they would have a chance to say that St. Petersburg can actually absorb modern infrastructures. We would have had a debate that would have resulted in a new building, in a new monument. But again, this is very subjective. It cannot be measured. So the experts, which are members of certain committees, cannot really make these decisions. And as you know, sometimes great architecture was done just with one signature, the signature of the emperor, the signature of the president, the signature of the minister from Titus. up to modern times, up to the presidents we have in the world today. So usually large business interests, they coincide with some public interests and the interests of the government. So we should not really regulate it. We should regulate to some extent the protection of cultural heritage, but architecture is impossible to regulate. Of course, we have the master plan of construction, and so on and so forth, but we have to guarantee the quality.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the high quality speeches that we had here. I'm really honored to be sitting here. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you that came here. And we are running out of time. Unfortunately, we have to finish. We could be sitting here for long hours, but unfortunately, we have to finish. Спасибо.